If I had known that Christmas Eve would end with my boss asking me to pretend to be his wife, I would have paid more attention to the first warning sign, the one that slipped in quietly, hidden inside an ordinary spreadsheet. Hello, everyone. Before anything else, I have to thank 3 comments that lit up my week and kept me writing late into the night. Maria in Chicago, Jonah in Manchester, and Priya in Melbourne. Your messages about choosing family over pride warmed this cold season more than you know. And trust me, the story you're about to read is exactly about that, only twisted into something far messier than any of us expected. The office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paper, a sterile warmth under fluorescent lights that buzzed like a tired insect. Outside, the city had folded itself in white, snow piling on window ledges and car roofs like careless promises. Ava Martinez sat alone at her desk, sleeves rolled up, fingers moving with a practiced rhythm on the keyboard, the soft clack of keys the only heartbeat in the quiet floor. She was the kind of person who kept the lights on for everyone else, who polished schedules and flattened crises into neat bullet points. Her breath fogged the inside of the window when she leaned closer, and for a moment, the world beyond became a watercolor blur of lamplight and falling snow. Peaceful, soft, the kind of moment that should have warned her. Quiet, like the inhale before everything unravels. He appeared without ceremony. Julian Hart, CEO, a man whose name alone rearranged the room like a tide, stopped at her doorway. He closed it with the calm of a man who had measured risk most of his life and decided it was time to place a very particular wager. He did not smile. His suit seemed engineered to avoid any warmth. His voice, when he spoke, was low and direct, an authority that carried the room like a physical presence. Ava looked up. Her pulse thudded in her throat, a private metronome she tried to ignore. She had been Julian's assistant for 3 years, compiling his calendar, extinguishing fires, knowing when he would need a coffee without his asking. She knew how he moved through rooms, how he avoided jokes, how his hands tightened around an idea before he let it loose. She did not know why, in that moment, his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "I need you to pretend to be my wife at Christmas," he said. The words hit like ice falling from a roof, sudden and sharp. "Pretend?" she asked, voice small. "At first, I thought you were joking," he said. "This is not a joke. There are obligations and appearances and family who have to be convinced. You would be with me for the weekend. You would speak as my wife. You would sit in the place at the table I have left empty for years." "Why me?" Ava asked. She could hear the question clear, a simple thing that cut toward self-respect. "Because you are discreet, efficient, and you have a face that can warm a room," he said. "Because you are the one person who will not ask for more than what is promised." "What is promised?" she asked. $200,000. "Enough to save my aunt's house," he said. "Sign this weekend, and the donation is wired the next Monday." $200,000. The number sat on her like a physical weight. It was more than numbers on a screen. It was a roof, a winter of heat, the small dental bill for her mother that had been growing for months on a kitchen table. It was the last anchor her family had in a neighborhood that had been selling off its edges. Her hand closed around the edge of the desk. She tasted metal, the tang of panic and possibility. "And there is a condition," he added. He has his own briefcase, a folder in it, the kind of precise document that smells faintly of new paper and lawyers. There will be rules. No real affection. No confessing affection. If either of us does, we must tell the other immediately and terminate the arrangement. The family must be convinced for a single night. That is all. 4 days. She thought of her Aunt Lilia's porch sagging under the weight of frost, the way the paint curled like old paper. She thought of her mother Rosa's hands, knuckled and habitually busy, and of the way their finances dissolved into silence whenever a bill arrived. She could imagine the roof caving in under the next winter of storms. She imagined saying no and watching the house get sold, the last of their history stripped away. "I have 3 hours to decide," she said. "Give me until tonight, and I will tell you." "Fine," he said. He closed the door with the same dry certainty, leaving the office to its humming, and Ava felt the cold of the corridor sweep in, as if the building itself had exhaled. This was the first shock. It set everything in motion. It was the kind of request that sounded like a dare, like fate wrapped in etiquette. The reward was a lifeline. The cost was her dignity in the eyes of a family she would barely know, and a clause that forbade any real engagement. There was clarity in that cruelty, a temporary lie for a concrete good. Backstory is a slow heat, not a flash. Ava had been raised in a narrow house with thin walls and thick loyalties. Her mother, Rosa, worked 2 shifts at a neighborhood diner, the coffee that kept waitresses like small stars afloat. Her father had left when she was 9, and the silence he left behind became a grammar of survival. Aunt Lilia, who had taken legal guardianship when financial papers had to be rewired, kept the mortgage receipts in a rusting tin box under mismatched towels. Ava had learned how to fix a leaky faucet with a borrowed wrench and how to say yes to tasks she did not want in order to buy her mother a new coat. She was 28, practical, fond of small rituals like steaming bread in winter and sketching the lines of houses on napkins while she waited for clients. She had studied architecture on scholarship for a year until the loans and part-time jobs demanded choices. She traded overnight classes for steady income, promising herself that one day she would return to the blueprints she loved. She loved the quiet geometry of stairs and the way light could make a small room feel like a cathedral. That longing lived in her, soft and patient, behind the demands of now. Julian's backstory was different in its coldness. He had been raised inside a house that taught him how to hold his face in public and how to place blame quietly. His mother had been a social architect, sculpting alliances at banquets and teaching him how to make currency out of presents. His father had been a man who negotiated love as a transaction. By 25, Julian saw the world as an arrangement of names and assets, of reputations that could be engineered and manipulated. He had learned to value control above surprise. The company he now ran was, in part, a fortress he had built to protect a fragile part of himself from the chaos of being undesired. There was a shadow that never left him, an old letter in the glove compartment he never opened, a regret tied to a childhood friend he had not been able to save. That vulnerability made him precise, even cruel, and it made him prone to solve problems not by kindness but by construction. She signed because choices are often made by the shape of need. The contract was concise and cold. It said the arrangement would be for 4 days for the purpose of convincing the Hart family there was a marriage. It said compensation was $200,000 to be transferred upon completion and suitable photographic evidence. It forbade emotional attachment, demanded immediate disclosure if feelings arose, and required her cooperation in staged photos and a staged dinner. The clause that mattered, the one that would later burn the pages of trust, was tucked in language that read like legal insulation. The contract required a witness and a signature at the city clerk's office to create a record of partnership for purposes of next of kin verification needed by the Hart Family Trust. She skimmed it, trusting the familiar lines that had always defined employment for her. She did not read the sentence about legal recognition. Julian explained, cool and patient, that the Hart matriarch trusted nothing that was not in a ledger. What was staged, he said, must be indistinguishable from truth to secure a donation and to keep the family bank from cutting funds to the charity that would save Aunt Lilia's house. It sounded like another abstraction until she realized the implication. Someone might contest this. The document was, in fact, a real document. She pushed her pen across the signature line with the practiced hand of a woman who had learned to sign away fears to buy light bulbs and medicine. When she told her mother, Rosa cried once, a single sound like a breaking cup. She did not question the lie. She counted the ways that money could make things new, that it could fix a roof and keep the lights on. Ava's brother Mateo, who still smoked cheap cigarettes behind the corner store, hugged her and said nothing, hands warm and clumsy. Lilia, at 72, tapped the receipt tin and said, "If this saves the house, then it is better to be cold and whole than warm and broken." The moral problem tasted bitter, like citrus peel. The week that followed was an education in performative intimacy. Ava learned how Julian preferred his coffee, how he laughed at things he did not mean, and how his jaw tightened when his mother's name came up. She also learned the way the Hart compound smelled of old money and cedar, a scent of polished wood and lemon oil. The house was a museum of family history, with photographs in heavy frames and a grand piano that sat like a black promise in the parlor. The staff had the practiced deference of people who had been shown how to behave around reputations. There was Nora, the housekeeper, who kept keys on a lanyard and knew every hidden drawer. Henry, the family lawyer, who smiled with the economy of someone who had defended reputations. Claire, Julian's sister-in-law, who measured everyone with a polite tilt of chin. Marcus, Julian's childhood friend, who told jokes too loud. And Evelyn Hart, the matriarch, whose gaze could curdle a room. The social tests were immediate. At dinner, Ava sat in a place that once had been empty, the weight of 1,000 eyes compressed into polite questions. The fire before them was bright, a controlled heat that made every color in the room feel alive. The soundscape was a collection of cutlery and small size, the piano in the corner playing chords like careful punctuation. The food tasted of butter and rosemary. The light on the table caught the ring Julian had placed casually on his finger, a thing that belonged to other stories. Conversations orbited around investments and society, around a family history that was both armor and identity. They asked Ava where she came from, what she liked, and in a dozen small ways tested whether her laugh was genuine or mechanical. Dialogue during the dinner stretched and tightened like a rope. 8 exchanges, 8 small reveals. Evelyn leant forward and said, "So Julian finally brought someone. Tell us about yourself." Ava felt heat on her palms. She spoke of a small house, of her mother's stew, and of the work that kept her hands steady. Claire asked about her education. Ava admitted architecture had been a dream, a confession she did not know could be tender. Marcus made a joke about city folk, and the room laughed in a way that was both welcoming and dangerous. Henry asked about what she thought of Julian. Ava smiled and said, "He is practical in ways I respect, and complex in ways I do not pretend to understand." Julian's hand brushed her on the back of her wrist in public, a small signal, and the camera flashes later captured the gesture like an assurance. Each exchange tightened something between them, a thread being woven with purpose, and Ava felt, in the quiet after dessert, how pretending could become a pressure that reshaped the inside. The night the pretense snagged at something real came unexpectedly. Snow had begun to fall thick as powdered sugar, muffling sound and making the walkways soft. Julian and Ava were alone in the library, the room smelling of ink and lemonwood. He had been distant all evening, the way someone carrying an explanation is distant. She had been watching lighting and shadow in his face and finding new landscapes she had not expected to like. He sat across from her, the fire between them sending small tongues of orange across his cheek. He was not rehearsing warmth. He had none to fake here. The conversation started as a practical exchange about Tamara's arrival times and the order of toasts. It slipped into something else. "You look tired," he said. She shrugged, tired in a bone sort of way. "You do this for them," he said, nodding toward the closed door that held a chorus of family faces. "For who else?" she asked. He paused. "For people who once kept you," he said. There was a silence long enough for a cup to cool. Dialogue again, a slow 8 exchanges. Ava asked why he really wanted this to work. Julian told her about the Hart Trust, about a scandal that could dissolve an institution if certain heirs were not reassured. He did not tell her the worst details at first, only that reputations had been engineered for decades, and that the foundation's grants would be killed if an heir's life looked unstable. He told her that he had exhausted other options. She asked if he regretted that the cost to her might be human dignity. He looked at her, and for the first time he let the shadow show. "I did not think of what it would do to you," he admitted. That was confession, half-formed. She said, "Then do you think you should have asked someone else?" He said he could not imagine trusting anyone else. They held their words like fragile glass. That night, a small scene of care became the hinge on which everything turned. Ava woke from a nightmare of roofs collapsing, sweat cold on her spine, to Julian's hand smoothing her hair with a tenderness that stunned her. He had sat up, listening to the irregular sound that came from her sleeping mouth, and had moved to sit near her. There was a moment when they both saw the smallness of their lives in each other's presence. He was not acting anymore in that quiet. He was clumsy and careful, and not the perfect constructed man who wore authority like armor. He brought her tea without asking, because he could read a cough as though it were a map. She felt the warmth of it, bitter and honest, and the thrill of being cared for without cameras or scripts rose like a tide. Gifts came next, as a ritual in which meanings exchanged hands. For Julian, the present was a small leather-bound volume of sketches he had seen Ava make once on a napkin. He had traced the lines and had the book bound under a discreet title. For Ava, the present was a small box of old family keys Julian had found in a drawer, curious trinkets that he said belonged to the heart's first home. The exchange was both a deception and a revelation. She realized in the careful way he presented the key that he was listening to the parts of her that were always background noise. She gave him a scarf she had mended the night before, a small thing that smelled of lavender and starch, practical and intimate. They both pretended not to notice what the gesture meant. The scarf made its way into his coat the next morning, visible to cameras and family alike. The weeks narrowed toward the Saturday that would be the test. Invitations had been adjusted, roles assigned, lines learned. The Hart family is precise. Evelyn had phoned from the dining room in a voice that suggested the world could be reordered by a single correctly placed compliment. The staff had rehearsed names and toasts. Ava had been coached by Claire in the fine art of easing tension with a well-placed laugh. The city clerk appointment had been scheduled with a quiet efficiency that made Ava's stomach drop. She had thought the arrangement would be performative, a tableau for photographs and speeches. She had not realized in the quiet rustle of paper that Julian had asked the Hallmark systems to register their names in a way that made the arrangement visible in a ledger that mattered to the Hart Trust. The signing at the city clerk's office was a small and terrifying betrayal, a legal step that turned a lie into a binding document. Julian had not told her before she signed. He had not wanted her to decline before he was sure the family would hold. The discovery cracked the room open. Ava found the document folded inside the folder with the last set of instructive notes 9 pages in, a single sentence buried in the legalese. Her voice went from steady to thin as she read. "You made us legally married," she said. Julian's face was unreadable. He had assumed consent from the signature on the contract, a move he justified as pragmatic. He said the signatures were a technicality, only to ensure the trust could not be contested. The trust required a legal spouse to approve an emergency fund release. It had been the only way, he said, to protect the charity connected to the Hart Foundation. Ava felt trapped between gratitude and outrage. She had signed, but not knowing that this would make her a legal spouse, not of a staged performance, but a registered record, felt like a theft of agency. The consequences were immediate and moral. She could annul the marriage. She could demand the money and leave. She could also, if she chose, refuse the funds and walk away with her pride. The family conversation that followed was a tangle of small judgments. Evelyn's tone was like cold silver. "You did what you had to do," she said, in a voice that suggested she had engineered this from another living room. Claire smiled with a practiced softness and said, "How brave of you both." Marcus, oblivious, clapped Julian on the back and said, "You two made a good team." But Ava felt the floor beneath her tilt. At this exact moment, 33% into our story, pause for a breath. If you were in Ava's place, how would you answer the question that now sits heavy between them? Would you accept a legal step that you did not fully comprehend to save a house and a family you love? This is where communities help, where opinions become answers for lonely people at a table. Write in the comments, "I would accept" or "I would refuse," and give one sentence why. Your words help others see perspectives they might not consider, and they shape future stories that explore the ethics of survival. It may seem small, but when someone is choosing between dignity and shelter, what you say matters. Now let us return to what unspooled after the signatures were dry. Ava chose to remain, but with conditions carved into the small space of her heart. She accepted the money and stayed for the Christmas festivities under protest, resolved to remember who she was outside of the Hart house. The public tests multiplied. A midwinter ball included a mistletoe moment, contrived yet catastrophic. The room glittered, music swelling like tide, and Julian and Ava were led to stand beneath the sprig, an act expected by guests who loved narratives. They had promised no real affection. They had promised confession if feeling bloomed. Yet when she looked at him under the low green leaves, the line between performance and truth smudged. Julian's hand found the small of her back. He looked at her with a vulnerability he had not intended to show. The kiss was both a script and a surprise, a tidal movement that seemed to break the clause by its very existence. The public kiss was a violation and a promise. Cameras clicked. Conversation halted in a dozen polite places. Something registered on Julian's face then, a fear and a hope braided together. The rule had been broken. The clause, which forbade affection, had been breached in front of witnesses who would spend months turning the event into a story. The aftermath was a small storm. Jane, Evelyn's friend, raised an eyebrow. Henry whispered to a page that the terms of the trust might be revisited if impropriety could be claimed. Claire turned her head and watched with a detached analysis of someone with a vested interest in narrative arcs. Marcus, who had been boasting about the holiday menu a second before, dropped his laugh like a coin. The rupture that followed felt inevitable. When secrets appear, they demand reckoning. Ava confronted Julian in the dim corridor outside the ballroom, the snow outside pressing against the windows like breath at glass. "You hid the legal step," she said. He did not deny it. He said he had panicked, and he had hoped that once the family was reassured, the emergency funds would flow and his moral calculus would be justified. She asked him if he thought love could be engineered. He said he had not thought about love at all, not as a variable, but now he found it an intrusive reality that would not be bracketed by documents. Their argument made the corridor feel narrow, the air close and white with emotion, and the words they used were small knives that cut at the truth. The climax came in a public rupture. Evelyn accused him of arrogance and of using another for a cause she did not understand. Julian defended himself with the weary logic of a man exhausted by institutional threats. Ava demanded the money be released before she would sign any more legal papers. The family lawyer, like Henry, stepped in with a procedural coolness, but the room had lost its civility. Julian accused Ava of betrayal by considering a public withdrawal, and Ava accused Julian of betrayal for not telling her the whole legal measure. The clause had been breached by both policy and heart. After the fight, a silence thick enough to sit on spread across the Hart parlor. Ava packed a small bag, the movements of her hands steady and mechanical, as if she were making a list and checking it off. She left a note on the mantel, words chosen to be clear and final enough to mark a boundary. She did not run. She walked through the snow to the bus stop, her coat pulled tight, the city feeling both enormous and suddenly intimate. The wind took the note from the mantel and made a small sort of music between chimney stacks. There were months of legal disentanglement, of calls, of lawyers, and of the human kind of grief that visits after trust is broken. Julian's attempts to reach her were circuitous and sincere in odd measures. He called his sister Claire, who forwarded messages like post and tried to translate his regret into gestures that might be permitted. He called Marcus, who offered physical tasks as if work could be a cure. Nora, the housekeeper, who had become an unexpected friend to Ava, left a scarf on her doorstep one cold morning, with no note but the small kindness of an unasked-for warmth. Rosa cried and said words that were both proud and tender, like a mother who has watched a child step into danger and come back changed. Mateo drove her sometimes and kept a battered thermos full of coffee in his jacket like an offering. The money had been wired as promised, the legal part annulled after a careful process that took weeks and left paperwork like detritus on Ava's kitchen table. The Hart Foundation released emergency funds for Aunt Lilia's house after Evelyn saw the sincerity in a single photograph of Ava and the repaired roof. But the person who had most to lose did not only lose a truth. He lost the naive illusion that control could contain consequence. Time, in the months that followed, became a teacher. Julian made small, public amends. He started a scholarship in the name of a community program that had meaning for Ava. He delivered it quietly through a contact who knew how to do good without headline. He also did something awkward and brave. He left his office door open and began to learn how to listen without immediate solutions, as if he were practicing an unfamiliar muscle. He visited small community centers that had accepted money and asked how he might be useful beyond checks. He did not expect forgiveness, but he did expect to be honest. A month later, she received a letter from Evelyn, short and boat-like. It said, "We are complicated people who often make clumsy choices. I see that you were there to do a kindness. For that, I am grateful." It contained a photograph of the house, the roof new and proud, snow sliding like a white ribbon. The feeling that came with the picture was a small relief that warmed the shoulders. The storm of winter had not fully passed, but it had left a cleared path behind it. 3 months after the Christmas arrangement, Ava found herself standing in a donated kitchen at a community center where she taught a class about basic home repair. Julian enrolled without fanfare in the same program, not as a donor, but as a student who wanted to learn how to hang a shelf. They worked together on a small shelf for the pantry, their movements a choreography of mending in public and laughing at mistakes. This was not a marriage, legal or otherwise. It was a reintroduction to each other as people with flaws and hands that could be steady. Nora visited with scones. Mateo joked about Julian's clumsy first attempts at screwing in a bracket. Claire invited Ava to a small, awkward lunch and apologized for the family's coldness, and her apology was an olive branch in a place of many thorns. 6 months later, the change was tangible. Aunt Lilia's house had a new porch, the paint a warm cream that made the windows look like eyes that had been cleaned. The Hart Foundation had redirected a modest grant to support neighborhoods in the same situation as Ava's, a move Evelyn defended at a board meeting with a speech that surprised many of her old friends. Julian wore a scarf Ava had mended and did not try to hide that he liked the way it smelled. He had slowed down in public, allowed himself small private jokes, and stopped framing decisions as solely his to make. Ava had returned to sketches, odd sheets of elevation studies found in her bag that she would later show to a small group of community organizers. There was a young couple who had received funding from the charity and who now invited both Ava and Julian to a casual dinner. They came, and the evening was quiet and human, with easy laughter and food that did not demand performance. By then, what had started as a contract masquerading as necessity had grown into something neither of them had named for fear of losing it. It was not a sudden revelation, but an accumulation of small vows and daily choices. Julian showing up at a utility meeting and not leaving until his part was done, Ava accepting his unhurried company while she painted bricks at Lilia's house. They taught each other a simple truth about boundaries and about the way love, when it arrives without ceremony, is sometimes more like a patient builder than an epiphany. The epilogue is in the small, undeniable changes that count as reconciliation. 1 month after the incident, the snow had melted enough that the porch steps were visible. Friends from the donation had come to help. 3 months after, a community center shelf stood straight and proud, its screws tight and its label crooked in the way of things that are lived in. 6 months out, Aunt Lilia planted bulbs in the garden with Ava and Julian elbow deep in earth, laughing at their failures and celebrating minor successes. The Hart Foundation had made a small public statement about responsibility and the dangers of secrecy. Evelyn had written a column in a local magazine about the moral obligations of wealth, and the piece surprised people with its softness. Julian had visited the community center and given a talk that left people relieved by his transparency. Ava had a new sleeping habit she trusted, having learned the rare feeling of someone not leaving during the night. There were still moments of tension. They were not cured of suspicion as if by a single remedy. Sometimes Julian's old reflexes returned, his default to problem solving as if people were projects. Sometimes Ava recoiled when a clause in a form smelled too legal, imagining ghosts of paper that could again bind her. They argued over small things, the way couples do, about how to invest the money from the scholarship, about the kind of roofline that made a house feel like a home. They also made largesses to the neighborhood hardware store where Mateo worked, paying forward kindness and learning that reputations could be remade not by a single good act, but by a pattern of doing good. The final image is quiet and sensory. It is a porch at dusk. A string of modest lights hum softly, and an old radio plays something like an old Christmas song. There is the smell of gingerbread baking somewhere inside, and the touch of gloves on hands that are neither performing nor hiding. Someone places a hand over another's on the railing, not as ownership, but as a shared grip against the cold. They laugh, small and real, and the last line that lingers is simple. They had begun as a contract to be lived through and ended as a choice to remain. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the lines between survival and dignity, please join this community. Share in the comments whether you would have accepted the contract and why, and if you liked the rhythm of this story, subscribe for more narratives that examine what people will trade for home. Your thoughts help shape which stories come next. Thank you for staying until the end.